Hey, good evening and welcome back to the Fall 2010 GSD lecture series and the last of our specifically landscape-driven offerings, although I think you'll find Shane Coen's work, tonight's speaker's work, relevant to a range of audiences in the building. For those of you who haven't met Shane yet, I thought I could say a couple of things by way of introduction. First, the facts. He's founder and principal of Coen and Partners based in Minneapolis and New York. And over the course of what's really now basically 2 decades, he's built an astonishing array of projects through his practice. Shane did his Bachelor's of Science in Landscape Architecture at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And over the course of the last 2 decades, since his work at Amherst, has pursued a kind of an approach to landscape architecture, which I thought I would typify in a couple of ways. First of all, it's an approach in which landscape architecture is reconnected with its historic relationships to craft and fabrication. This is, I think, particularly relevant today, as much of landscape architecture has been focused on questions of the urban. Landscape architecture has found a renewed voice at the urban scale and with respect to urban and ecological challenges. Coen's practice, among other things, has reminded us that, in fact, the landscape architect brings a level of consideration and skill at the scale of craft. And so much of his work is typified by a level of attention to detail and materiality. It's also fair to say that over the course of the last 2 decades, Coen's practice has generated an extraordinary array of peer review with literally dozens and dozens of regional and national awards from the American Institute of Architects and the American Society of Landscape Architects. To give you an example, over the last 18 months, Coen's practice has received 5 ASLA awards, three regionally and 2 nationally. Along the way, he's been one of, I think, a very, very small number of landscape practices to be recognized with a Progressive Architecture PA Award. He's also, last year, recipient of the Emerging Voices Award of the Architectural League of New York. I think another way of describing or introducing to you the work of Shane Coen would be, in a way, while Shane is a young designer and an emerging voice, somebody who really harkens back to a set of old school set of values about craft and consideration. In that context, I first came to know Shane's work through a series of suburban projects where he was essentially trying to bring a landscape sensibility to the development of suburbia. Over the course of the last couple of years, his work has more recently been characterized in institutional contexts with a range of museum exhibitions. While he's lectured widely and in many, if not most, of the leading design schools across North America, I'm very, very proud to say that it's here at the GSD in the Department of Landscape Architecture that he's embarked on his first teaching experience here, teaching a studio for us this fall. Please join me in welcoming Shane Coen.
Hello. It's an honor to be here. I'm very pleased. I had a huge presentation last night for a project, then flew out here today, and I've been thinking about this for quite a while, looking forward to it. And I've fully enjoyed teaching here this semester, and Charles invited me to do that, so I feel very blessed. I'm also really grateful for my finding landscape architecture and my career. But my career is very much about although I started my practice right out of school, I've never worked for anybody, it's very much about the we, and it's about the collective. And the longer I'm in practice, the more I believe in that. Not just at my own firm, where I have an amazing group of collaborators that each are bringing their voice to all of our projects, but I believe in reaching out to the world's leading and emerging artists and architects and planners and engineers to try to be influential and form teams. Because I really believe the only way we're really going to address big issues is through very serious collaboration. And so I'm going to start talking a little bit about that. I'm going to address rural issues in the introduction, and then the ideas of working with engineers on infrastructure projects as landscape architects, and then the city process, and then a little bit about K through 12, and then we'll start to get into some work. So I grew up on summers on my grandfather's farm, and rural images and patterns have always been a huge influence on me throughout my life and my work. And there's no hiding that farm subsidies are on the decline, and the family farm is being sold. And it's actually being inherited. It's being inherited by siblings, by a second generation, a third generation. And these siblings are struggling to figure out what to do with this land that they absolutely love. And they really have to, in most cases, in a lot of cases, they have to generate revenue from it, so they have to sell it. And they're struggling with, do we develop it ourselves? Do we co-develop it? Do we sell it to a developer? And it's been very popular and important to attack urban issues, but the ex-urban environment, it's not going to go away. Like, everybody's not going to move to the city. And so we really need to be thinking about how we're going to address these issues. And I think we all know that in a suburban context, the infrastructure is not there. So we have to be very creative with wetland septic systems and community wells and permanent preservation of open space. But really, what's amazing to me is that I kind of feel like we've had our heads in the sand in the suburban world, really, as far as teaming up, as far as architecture, architects and landscape architects designing these ex-urban environments, and landscape architects really kind of gave this away to the civil engineer, many years ago, and are now starting. Some of us are starting to take that back. And we need to take that back. And as we take that back, we need to invite architects into the process, and we have to figure out how to build ex-urban communities in a way that the developers can make more money than they can building these kind of terrible suburban sprawls that we're all very familiar about seeing at this point. But there's so many architects that have built, that really pride themselves on building these like amazing, really incredible single-family homes, but it's just so rare to see them teaming together on these sorts of issues. And I'm talking about, and I'm not just talking about housing. I'm talking about the strip malls and all the infrastructure that goes around these things. So, really what I'm promoting here is us like really coming together, in a big way, and just kind of taking on this issue. And in order to do that, we have to get involved in writing the codes for these ex-urban environments, as well as pulling together, very powerful teams. So. I also want to talk about infrastructure. I mean, we're bringing, amazing teams to the table for these kind of redevelopment projects in the urban areas, which is, wildly exciting. And landscape architects need to be leading those as well. I led a development last year that I'll show you later that I brought in a team of, really highly innovative architects. But it's kind of the on-ramps and the bridges that come into all of our cities that are just completely get ignored. When are we going to start partnering with the highway departments and the structural engineers that do these projects that cost an enormous amount of money, and we can do the same, the exact same thing, but in a completely inspired way. And that's the challenge, let's start to think about these things that we drive by every day and just completely ignore and take them over. And the only way we're going to do this is with complete collaboration, really getting into the highway departments, which are very difficult to infiltrate, and these big engineering firms, and convincing them that they need powerful architects and landscape architects on their team. We're not going to take their money away. We're actually going to get them more jobs in the future. So it's very important. And in the city process, we need leaders at the city level. And this is a very, very difficult territory to navigate. We have very few leaders in a lot of different cities in the city planning room. And one of the reasons is that in a lot of cities, the city council has the power and the planner doesn't. And they essentially have to go and report on if a project meets the code. And if you want a variance, you have to prove hardship. Okay, this is the complete absurdity of variances if you don't have designers with power in the public process. If we can get leaders at the city level that actually can talk about variances that are based upon the merit of a project versus just following the strict, a rule of the code, then we're, as landscape architects, we're going to be in a real different place where we can impact change. In the Netherlands, I attended a conference, learning from the Dutch, a few years ago in Chicago. They completely embraced this idea, the idea of design, and at the highest level, the affordable housing. I forgot what his title was, but the person in charge of affordable housing in Amsterdam was there at the conference. And we spoke, we had, it was all on infrastructure, and then he got up and he started talking and said, we have one very, very simple mission statement, which is every project we build strives to be more architecturally significant than the last. And they do that with infrastructure as well as all their, affordable housing projects. How can we possibly bring that sort of thing here? It's not easy. One of the ways that I believe that we have to do that is with all of us actually spending some time in K-12 education. Because if you don't have anybody that's taught you how to see, it's very hard to see. If you grow up, all of us probably had somebody, a father, an uncle, somebody that taught us how to see spaces and architecture. And if you didn't have that, then most of the country is actually kind of blind to the aesthetics of our country. So I really, truly believe that we should all be spending a little bit of time at K through 12 every year. And then also with the policymakers at K through 12, really thinking very hard about how we can integrate, is integrated into many of the European history books, architecture design at a very early age. And today, design is so wildly exciting, from devices to architecture, landscape architecture, and planning. And we have to get those into the K through 12 school system. So anyway, that's my speech. But the thing is that we live in an exciting time. We, as landscape architects, are being recognized as a very serious profession in a completely different way than when I opened my firm 20 years ago, and in a completely different way 10 years ago, and even 5 years ago. We are in a very strong position of power, and we are in a very strong position to collaborate, and so we need to be doing that. All right, I'm going to present, this is the town that I live in, 670 people, and it was one of my first projects in Mereen on St. Croix, Minnesota. It's the oldest town in Minnesota. Those are on the National Historic Landmarks. That's the town hall. And the library, which was the original general store, and the mill. All the houses on the historic registry in Mereen are white, and they have standing metal seam roofs. This is where I vote. This is a church that almost everybody but me goes to. Another really old, I love this house. It's called the Johnson House. This was kind of the scale of the architecture. And what happened is we got asked to develop a parcel of land that constituted 80% of the development rights in the town of Mereen on St. Croix. Okay, so this is the parcel of land, and there's the town. And we showed up at the first town planning commission meeting, and this is the land. I walked up there on the first time and just kind of gasped. In fact, my house is 30 feet in back of this. And then we went to the first town planning commission meeting, and it was packed with angry residents. 670 people in town, we had 200, in that town, as the news had spread that a developer was going to develop this land. And instead of showing an idea, what we did is we systematically showed them their town. and everything that they love about it. We showed them that their roads are 16 and 18 foot wide without curb and gutters, that their garages are 5 feet off the road instead of 30 feet off the road. We showed them that their streets are actually inverted crowns in many situations where the water runs down the middle, a total no-no today. And then we showed them the architecture. And then we very delicately took out their new code that they had just passed and showed them how there's no possible way we could ever build a new community in any way that emulated their town. And therefore, we needed to go through a planning and development process. So this was the land. This was the organizing element right here, which is we called it a whale's back. The idea was to create a circulation system around that. And then the section line of the farm runs right here. So to do a village here, and then the outer lots would follow the topography the same way that the houses in Mereen on St. Croix follow the river, the topographical river. So the circulation system is far more about pedestrians than it is about automobiles. And David Samala, somebody that I've done 50 projects with, not counting this as one, developed a quick typology pattern for the housing. And David designs all the houses, and my firm places all the houses. And this is also an art that we've given away. It's actually placing the houses not only horizontally, but vertically, down to the 1/8 inch. And then it's very different working in a community where people don't live, they didn't hire you. So when they buy in here, they have to work with, my firm, and they have to work with David. So you get to educate them on a design process. But we have 70% of the land in permanent conservation easements. And I think, besides the architecture and the landscape architecture and the preservation, there's this education on design that just naturally happens by the people that come there and live there. And I think one of the most interesting things is when people come by and drive through, I used to always ask people, or they'd stop and ask me questions, and I'd say 70% of them would say, geez, all the houses look the same. They're white, the guidelines are white, standing metal seam, can't build a house wider than 24 feet, you have to have a detached garage in freezing conditions. And then the other 30% would say, I can't believe how different these houses look. And that's what I'm talking about as far as being educated to see. In the winter, it's, kind of stunning. This is what I looked at a couple weeks ago when I woke up, or 1 week ago. It's grown quite a bit. We're photographing it again this year. And then for each house, I place it, I work collaboratively with David Samala to place the house and just do a very basic site plan. And people that want to take it further, we can take it further. But they quickly get educated on the principles of the architecture and landscape architecture working together, geometrically, with simple spatial forms and materiality. And this house is only 16 feet wide at the base, and then cantilevered over, and there's just this slice right through it. It's one of my favorite. It's little blue stem on the right, on the left, and then Nomo fescue on the right, and that's a house to build orchids, to grow orchids in. This is a pergola pulled off the path. You don't walk under it. It's just a sculptural element that aligns with the large window. And so it's another dialogue. That should not be there. We were testing slides earlier. This is Johnson residence. Subi Logan, stairs just landing on a lawn with a field of little blue stem. Brian Gruis. I believe in placing structures on plinths, on residential, rather than ever planting up against it. I never plant against a house or a building. I always leave a very flat plane around them and pull the planting away from the house so that the house is rooted to the ground. And any planting you actually get a look at, when you're inside, and you're not hiding the architecture and union between architecture and site. This house was just cut in to the hill with this dry stacked wall. This is the last one we did. And the width of the lawn is the same as the width of the house. And then this pergola takes you to the front door. That's our well house for the community well. And that's my son looking for crawdads, right, when we moved in a lot of years ago. He's turning 17 here pretty quickly, so. And that's my daughter. She's still got the same attitude, though. So then, this project, that project continues to just be a blast. It's a puzzle of the people that live there and placing the new homes and keeping the right view corridors through and educating. So then the Mayo family came to me, the Mayo family from the Mayo Clinic, and they asked me if I would, by chance, work on a project for them. And I went and looked at the land. The land was gorgeous, flat, very, very flat. But the plan had been developed by engineers, and it was in place and approved. The plat was approved. And so I didn't know if I wanted to take it. But this is the town of Rochester in 1890. And you can see that the grid pattern existed clearly at that time. And by 1950, the beginning of the suburban pattern started to reach out. And then by 1980, the dendritic suburban pattern had completely taken over and turned its back on the organizing elements of the city. And then there's our site in 2008. And the land, as I said, is flat. It has a few natural drainage systems running through it. This is the project that won a PA award, which was really interesting because I didn't want to do the project. And the reason why is, this was the land originally, and it had plowed furrows running east and west. Historically, this land was always farmed east and west. This black is the tree line with a very strong north-south access here, and then this beautiful prairie back here, and then the river, Zambruto River down there. And this was the plan the engineers came up with. Now, the interesting thing was they actually modeled it after Jackson Meadow. And yet, this is very, very typical where an engineer comes up with a plan, they just kind of wander the roads through there. The trees follow a meaningless road system that's not responding to topography, it's not responding to the section lines of the farms, it's not responding to the old farm, anything, any of the old, of the past. So we decided to take the project, and in a charrette one night, the first thing we did is we said, all right, we're going to blanket it with corn. We're going to plant, not really corn, but we're going to plant, a tall Indian grass over the whole thing, 6 feet tall, and we're going to erase the lot lines. And then we started to rewrite the code, and that you could have a cutout for your lawn, but you had to have 30 feet of space between you and your neighbor that the prairie flowed through, so that the prairie moved through all of these, and you had privacy, without a fence, essentially. And then we planted 3,000 pine trees in an east-west fashion across the site to really recall the farm, the windrows of the farm. And now the street pattern actually started to get pretty interesting because you're kind of starting to move through this very organized system. And then the fences were actually mechanisms, structure to walk along, because like in so many suburban developments, there were no sidewalks, and the plat had been approved, and we couldn't go back to the city. That was one of the rules. So, everyone would be walking down the road. So instead, they would walk along these fences to go talk to their neighbors. And then finally, the architecture, which also ran east and west, had to have detached garages. The reason I promote detached garages, even in cold climates, is you can organize the house and the garage in a way that creates space in between those. And also, as soon as they started attaching the garage, of course, a quarter of your view was taken away, and everybody walks through their garage into their mudroom of their house and never gets to experience their house from the front door. So this is one of my favorite diagrams. So here's what's evil about cul-de-sacs is, well, not evil, they're just so wrong, is that every house just kind of turns their back on the next one in order to orientate themselves for some reason to the center of the cul-de-sac. And the streets, the street trees, reinforce this. So this kind of before and after became such an interesting study for us. It did win a PA award, and I really encourage landscape architects to go after architectural awards as well. And then it's been exhibited at the Walker and Carnegie and Yale and around. So it's been really fun. I started one right before the crash in New York and as well in Amenia, which is just over the hill from Millbrook. A beautiful farm. It is like the view shed that everybody in Millbrook has been afraid that somebody was going to develop this farm for so many years. And it had this, these really great, it's a stud farm, so all these horses, and they rotated them very well, so the farm really stayed quite pristine. But there was this great geometry created by them. And so we definitely right away said, let's retain the horses. There's a new development going over there, so we were just measuring how high we would have to block them out. And so we went back up to the main view shed. This is right when you come over the hill. And with the developer, who was a very progressive guy, Jeff Stark, I said, well, let's just develop that. And follow the tree lines, have a lower village, and then every neighborhood will keep the horses intact in every field, and everyone will have a horse. Not a horse to ride, but view of the horses in a field. And so that was the basis of the plan. We kept the old road and infrastructure in place because there's 7 barns located around it for all the horses. And then the topography was such where we could actually keep the houses close to the tree lines and step them down the hill. And again, a detached garage. So we're super excited to build it. Looking for an investor. Our one's still strong. We lost, the other one went under. But it's a super exciting opportunity. So then, moving to the urban level, this was a project that I started in St. Paul that also stopped during the crash, but was super interesting. This is downtown St. Paul. This is always the industry of the old rail lines coming here. This is our development area here. The program was a new pro soccer sports venue, an academy for the soccer to make it a very active campus, the tallest new building in St. Paul. And I proposed Office Dot to do the soccer stadium to the developer. We led the whole process. So Office Dot to do the soccer stadium that has a hotel on top and is totally encased by multi-purpose. Architecture Research Office to do the school. Tom Pfeiffer to do the new tower. GTech was already on board to do another tower. And then a new emerging firm promoted that's really about graphics and architecture. One's graphic designer and one's an architect. Young firms in New York from Sweden called Malobi. So as I said, all the old rail lines, always ran through this site. So our plan was very much going to be about a linear park that ran through and reorganizing the street system here back to the original grid. And so looking down 4th Street, this was Gordon's building that had a gap that you saw through. And then Office Dot's soccer stadium. That you would kind of, you'd move through here, and this is architecture research proposal for the school. And the stadium stacks up and has a hotel in the top, as I said, and then AROs. Malobi's for the parking garage, which ended up in the end having a cafe up top and a grocery store at the base level. It evolved. And then Tom Pfeiffer, contextual as always, one of my favorites, hit the parking facility at the same, with multi-use down below at the same level as the adjacent building, started thinking about materiality from the get-go, and really came up with an amazing scheme for this tower that was all about light and the way the light hit it and moved. And then we would put all the architects' proposals together and pull the team back to Minneapolis or go to New York and run sections and do images and talk about, okay, how are these buildings speaking with each other? Do they need to speak to each other? Do they not need to speak to each other in an urban context? Ultimately, we said they don't need to speak to each other. I mean, they need to speak to the city and the fabric. And if everybody's doing that, they will speak to each other. And so, that was it. And we were super close to getting this started. It could come back as well. I actually spoke to the developer today. Greenwich last year, one more hypothetical, we had an assignment for the World Trade Centers to hook it down to Greenwich Park. Now this is an example of an architect reaching out to a dynamic team. So Stephen Cassell from Architecture Research Office reached out to us as the landscape architects, Iowa Moda Scott, Morphosis, Work, and we all came together for this kind of brainstorming ideas. But in their proposal, their brainstorming ideas where everybody was kind of doing their own thing. So they were very separate. So ours was about green infrastructure, planting, ground plane, and illumination. And Greenwich Street is a really bad street. It's kind of a dog of a street. And so we were using, really changing the dimension of the street, using illumination to create a much more pedestrian-friendly environment, and then using the green infrastructure both as solar collectors to power all the lights and create really a facade of structure that marched down the street. And then we were collaborating with ARO on this new market place for the city that you could come up, and this was the cap to the battery tunnel. So it was a new marketplace. It won a PA award this year as well, the whole study. Okay, we'll get into some built work. Much of my work has been about collaborating with architects. This is Tulane University with Vince James, who's taught here for a long time and is definitely one of my favorite architects. This project is all about a dialogue between architecture and landscape architecture, as every light is informed by the placement of the column. The railings moved from the inside of the building, outside of the building. The benches were designed based upon elements from the interior of the building. There's a delicacy to Vince's work that we wanted to bring to the outside. The long bench, which is actually a flood wall, is designed by the same sunshade mechanism, the same wood as the sunshade mechanism, wraps the building. And then there's these vine screens that interact with the building that move up and down in different places. And then when they move into the pocket park, we use the same wood turned vertically for the screens to create sitting areas. Now this totally transforms at night, because at night the vine screen turns into a projection screen that I don't have photographed yet, and then they watch movies and perform here. The library with Cesar Pelli was also a really cool collaboration. We had no budget. We had $1.2 million for the block. But the building was so kind of huge here that we just had these really delicate railings that lined up with the mullions. Cesar wanted a garden around the building. I told you we never do gardens around the base of the building, so we were kind of perplexed on what to do. But we found this quarry that was unused in northern Minnesota, and we were able to get all this stone actually for free. They were going to throw it away. So we had this slate brought down. But the other thing that Cesar did is he pulled the building back from the urban edge right here. So the whole city lines up along this line. But this building pulled back. So we designed these light poles and this bench, but we pulled the light poles and the garden right out to that edge to reinforce it. And then from the other side, so this is Hennepin Avenue, and the bench is made out of aluminum, and it's a 3/4 inch with a 1/2 inch gap. And then it switches back and forth so you can look at the city or the building. And this is just kind of shows how we had to mitigate the grade, because the building had the same finished floor elevation all the way around it. And then the birches just marched down. Escofet benches. So we were able to accomplish quite a lot for the 1.2, but definitely a restrained, a minimal approach, which is, our philosophy. It's beautiful in the winter, though. Just finished this. This is a GSA Design of Excellence program, Warroad, Minnesota. So this is a collaboration with Julie Snow. And if you're coming from Canada, you have to come through here and out here. So we took that same shale that they were basically giving away, but then they started charging for it now. We stacked it in a new way. And we had birch on one side and larch on the other, but you actually move through here when you're coming into the United States. And the building's quite beautiful. And there's just, again, these kind of shale gardens that exist here. The larch, we didn't have a big budget for this either, but when they grow and turn yellow, they're going to be quite amazing. This is me trying to get the perfect picture of that, which the truck was in the way. It was the grand opening, but this dark Virginia shale, and then this is a sedum. That was planted, kind of in between, and it's really sets the place on fire. Collaboration with Stan Allen last year for a park in Korea. There was a lot going on in this park, two huge bodies of water and kind of these cultural gardens moving down. And our proposal was just to have an elevated bar that essentially was organized. The open space was organized by plants based upon their understory and the microclimates that existed on the site. But the bar was really about a biofiltration system for the runoff and rainwater and the ponds and a purification. So it was collected here, and then the bar was highly programmed as you move across it. We were finalists for this and went to Korea for the competition and did not win. And Stan's museum kind of popping out and a soccer field in the middle of it. Cool. When it turned the corner, then it started to get activated with restaurants and multi-use. Winning competition in Toronto, where I met Charles with Office DA, which has now moved to a new site, so I'm not showing a lot of it. But I think a big part of the winning entry was the programming of this site, which is the new landscape architecture and architecture building. There was very little room on the outside, so the idea was to bring the library up to the top and then create a roof garden that the library would walk out onto. There was a card catalog of plants, of roof plants. And that concept of bringing the library up to here and then moving out onto it really is, and it was us and Stephen Hull and Ramesh were the teams. Excel, very flexible urban space in downtown Minneapolis, but it's security issues. It's a roof garden and the whole central substation for Minneapolis is underneath it. So the building is really quite beautiful. We took black granite instead of the orange and used the same dimension width-wise but longer and created a security wall that's reinforced with massive amounts of steel. And then on the inside had these kind of large areas for lounging, these kind of epay benches that form the edges, also security barriers. A metal screen that we proposed to be a projection wall that got cut at the last second, and then a flexible stage for performance that they do let a few performances happen in here each year. Again, just, very simple geometry, materiality, repetition. This was cool. This was a landmark. This won a National ASLA last year. This is the oldest church, this in Basilica, the oldest church in Minneapolis. There used to be a limestone wall here with a wrought iron fence. We got hired to do a celebration plaza and the first Columbarium in Minnesota, so this is to intern ashes. And so instead of doing a wall with a fence, we found this stained glass window that was repeated around the church and very, very much loved, and started playing around with perforated copper panels. So we took the image of the stained glass window in our office and made 8-foot panels out of it and started filling in dots to make this kind of abstract, this pattern. And the result was really quite fascinating on the transparency. And so we went back to the church, and they were expecting a wall and a picket fence, and presented this idea. And I mean, they were really excited, which was so great that they felt we captured the spirit of their church with this idea. What's so cool that I like about it is when you're at an angle, it plays tricks with you. So it starts to move. It makes circles when you're moving towards it. Inside, this is all the roof gardens. We could only plant right to here. We just have a very simple runnel that reinforces the line of the street and the wall, and honey locusts. And the moving water. It's starting to patina. I was just there. This is next to the project that we went after last night. This is the Columbarium, which I made him take off his cap. It wasn't supposed to have a reveal. We finally got it removed this year. So kind of moving up into the Columbarium space. And then Westminster. From the inside, we didn't fill in, it's a straight perforation. So from the outside, the pattern is played with, and the inside is a straight perforation, which is what gives it the movement and the kind of excitement and transparency. When we perforated both sides on the test panels, it didn't move. You would get this weird, so there's something about just the straight perf on the back that made it, and then on the inside, I think it made it more delicate. This also won a National ASLA last year. This is a house that used to have a huge circular driveway here with spruce trees, and really kind of cool, kind of old case study like house. And we just took these, we often turn pavers upside down because the concrete pavers today have a bevel on them, and the old pavers were wire cut. So we'll take concrete paver and turn them upside down to just give them a more crisp edge. So these are Hanovers. And we just pulled the straight concrete wall to echo the line of the house out, move the driveway over to where the garage is, and really worked on with the concrete on this project with the local contractor. And then you move around through this aggregate and this bosque of trees, and the idea was to save this oak tree. But in the back, his property is to start sloping right here. So just a very simple 14-foot terrace, red barberries. The core-tin wall reaches from front to back for privacy, and then an epay deck here and here. Move down to the pool. I think the limited color palette here of the white and the red and the core-tin just makes the trees come to life. It's very restrained. You always got to think of winter, Minnesota. I love this image, which is the concrete, the core-tin, and the oak tree. Just finished this last year. This is for the Polad, the owner of the Minnesota Twins. That was the entry. And then as you move around to the back, you go through this series of granite walls that are actually window wells. And there's equisetum that comes up from them. And then you move around the corner of the house to the very corner here, confronted with a wall and a line of birch trees and a column of upright yews, vinca minor. And then you move through to the pool area, and the pool, all the lines in the pool are talking to the building. It's a zero-edge pool. And then the city in the background. This is the epay deck that sits above the zero edge, which is these simple stairs that walk down. And I'm just going to end with some images of projects that talk about geometry between house and landscape and materiality and simplicity. And this is the streeter. It's also about siding, very simply siding architecture. Sits on a plinth, flip the pavers upside down on this one as well. The plinth lines up with the overhang. Vince James, again, there's a whole book on this house, but we were very collaborative with him and helped him, actually recommended the materiality of the base of the building. And this was more about really just having this house just kind of land in the forest on a plinth of stone. And framing the landscape with structures. It's a great book called Type Variant. Matthews, little teeny lake lot in Minnesota with David Samala. No lawn, it's meadow, and then you move up through 30-inch wide path, through the garage structures, and in. Smith. My philosophy is if you're going to plant one plant, 100 or 500 or 1,000. 8-foot wide pool. Albrecht residence. This is for his collector car. And then this is Cypress. So is this. You move in around these walls. Just not quite done yet in Gallatin. Another new project. Another new project. This is in East Hampton with Paul Massey. Just very simple dialogue between the building and site. Another Paul Massey project in Montauk. And no matter how small a project is or how big, what I've found is it's about the client wanting to do something, fun, and it's about the team. And equal amount of thought goes into everything from the smallest structure to the largest city, that you're going to design. So thank you for your attention. Yeah. Great.
Question or two?
Sure, if anybody has any, I'd be happy to. Yeah.
I wonder, you talked a little about how you got the town of St. Croix. I'm from a small town in Minnesota, so I
Mhm.
know that mentality sometimes. Oh, thanks. I wondered how the town reacted to the project after. Does the town accept it and
Yeah.
and use it, or is it kind of still the thing on the hill compared to
It's
the
been a really interesting social experiment. I didn't really go into the detail. It took 42 town planning commission meetings to get the plat approved for 42 Tuesday nights in a row, in which I went to 41. It took about 8 meetings, and everyone was open to the public. It took about 8 meetings to form a team, to form a bond with the planning commission and the majority of the town. But it's rural Minnesota, are you kidding me? There's still 30% of that town that is like, anti. Which is always so interesting because whenever it's like published, and it's been published a lot, it ends up down in the general store and everything. But for the most part, it's been really accepted. The first 4th of July parade, which is a big deal in Mereen, we won. We all wore white robes with tin hats and marched down the street. And, that was actually kind of a part of getting accepted by the town as well. But for the most part, we have council members and everyone from our community now, and a lot of people in the fire department, which is a big deal out there. So now, we're way past that point. And plus the trail system, we have a public trail system of 5 miles that we groom for cross-country skiers, and we actually advertise that it's open to anyone and everyone in the Twin Cities. We actually put it in like ski magazines to come out and use our trails. And then the town too. So it was on the trails, like if you would have done private trails, it was on the trails that we all met, the town and everybody started to meet. It was really, very important, kind of the opposite of private development to really make it a very public space. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. It's beautiful work. My question is, it seems like this attention to detail and really high quality design is kind of more of an exception rather than the majority of the work that's out there. Why do you think that is?
Rephrase it. You mean?
It's not very common to see actually in, like, I would say the majority of, like, let's say the kind of standard development that's out there is not the attention to the detail, to the materiality, to the experience. Do you think that's a result of an education system that, for example, that trains designers not to think that in such a sophisticated manner, for example, or do you think it's more of the economics of it that allows a bit more mediocrity to exist out there?
No, I think it's getting turned on. It's being open to make the right relationships. We all have mentors, right? My first mentor was my dad. It was this amazing artist. My next one was my wife, who taught me how to see in this really interesting way about never, she couldn't go into a room without freaking out, hating it, or loving it, and really got me to start, thinking at a different level. And then my business partner, the only reason I was able to open a firm right out of school is I met a guy named John Stumpf, Bill Stumpf, a very famous industrial designer, and John was getting ready to open a firm. And I met him by accident. He was a very quiet, reserved person. I was kind of the opposite. And he asked me if I wanted to open this firm with him straight out of school, which was, kind of crazy. But he was registered, and he was a master detailer. And he also would do these master plans. I mean, I remember the first time like I ever got a plan to the one that him and I picked, because in the beginning we would do them, and John's would be better. And then I could see it, and so I wasn't going to argue about it. But there was this simplicity of solving function, and we really called it about subtraction. That still exists in our office today. It's like designing by subtraction. How can you create the fundamental framework for this project with as few lines as possible? Then, how do you detail it? And so he was a mentor. And then there's these people, all the people that have passed through my office, and the people that are there. Everybody brings a different suite of talents. But I mean, I have some incredible detailing people, and we all kind of share the same passion. And then I've been working with these consultants that are really about the power of the collective and bringing out the most in everybody. But not everybody's going to do everything. Be the detailer. And when you come out of school, everybody wants to be the conceptual designer, which is always the hardest thing to find somebody coming out of school that actually wants to get into details. Which is one of the reasons why we're going to tackle it in the studio next here. I don't know, it's just been a natural evolution of who I met, and I'm really open to it. And I've spent my career, just flying to meet architects that I love. When I see an architect I love, they go on my list, I send them something, and then I call them up and say, I'm coming to visit. When the recession hit, I booked like a 20 or 25 point stop around the country. And I went and met 25 architects that I'd never met before. Took them out to lunch, showed them our work, told them what I loved about their work. That's how we made it through. In fact, I got the project with Michael Walton on that trip. It was a good move.
Hi.
Hi.
What is one of the most influential aspects a context can have on your design?
Well, I mean, for me, it starts with geometry. But I think, it totally has to do with, the context is so different in a rural setting or an urban setting. I mean, there's just so many different contexts to play from. But the most influential to me and the most fun projects to me are one where you're getting context from a piece of architecture, actually, that hopefully you were involved with from the very beginning. So there was a play on that, but it's located within a dynamic context, which, say, the city. And so there's a pull from one direction from the city and the infrastructure of that, and then there's a radiation out from the architecture and the radiation back in from the site. And so it's the kind of the push-pull of those two elements. In a rural landscape, it's very, very, very different. But I've never drawn a curved garden. I haven't even done a circular one in my life. I really love radiating out from the building. Now, even when I've had buildings with very curvilinear forms, I've tended to put a rectangle around them because when you then mimic them, I feel like it takes the power out of that move. So there is, and now is that contextual? A rectangle around that. I mean, so when you're in nature, I don't believe that you can mimic Mother Nature or Mother Earth, and I never try to. So, in the middle of a meadow, my favorite thing to do would be to just put a pure rectangle or square in the middle of a meadow and let the meadow be the context. You're just there to kind of be in it.
Hi. I'd love to hear more about your design process. When you get a project, do you sit down and do the same thing to start, or do you usually, I'm curious to hear how you get started on a project and how that develops, if there's general.
Yeah, well, I try now and more with the architects I work with to get involved from the get-go, because really the way landscape architects think about siting structures is completely different than the way that architects think about them. That's a generalization. But I'm going to say that If you can get to, we see land in a totally different way and context, and we're not thinking about our object when we're looking at that land, right? We're thinking about their object, which is less important to us. We're thinking about the context. And so how should this building be positioned in the urban or the rural? So that's my favorite place to start, is on site at the very beginning of the project. Now, when that doesn't happen, and we come in after the fact, we do start in a very similar process. And it varies within my office because I'm trying to build leaders. But it's you know, certainly there's a lot of quiet time that I'll spend on a project. But we do a lot of shredding in our office too. So there's actually a new kind of policy in an office. Is when I bring in a project, I present it to the team at the Monday morning meeting, and we talk about the project. The team is formed by the project management team. That team gets together to talk about the ideas, and we go from, and in that meeting, there's a series of ideas that are formed about geometry and dialogue. And then it continues to build. In our office, you know, we're trying to encourage everybody to do projects, to take a project from analysis through CDs. But we do have a strong conceptual team and a strong CD team, but we don't divide it up like that. The CD team and myself is meant to mentor the front end team, and the front end team is obligated to mentor the back end. And then, I mean, it gets to be a really exciting process when you have the people doing the real details in the schematic design meetings as well. You can start to develop the details then at the schematic design level, which gets to your question. So in the very beginning, we'll do a framework, and we'll identify the key elements, and we'll start designing ideas for those details in schematic. Lights, benches, walls, whatever it is. Thanks very much. Great. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, I really appreciate it.